Fair warning. If you are suffering from a mental illness of some kind, if you have depression or an anxiety disorder or Asperger's or some other kind of autism, anything like that, prepared to be offended by the horrible prosecution from the U.S. government and their behavior in Day 15 of the Assange trial. I cannot stress this enough. This is offensive. This should not be allowed. And James Lewis and everyone else who's involved in making these arguments should be fired, should be disbarred. They are horrible human beings. And if you think I'm exaggerating here, just wait. You might find that I'm actually understating it. So, Craig Murray points out that when Ellsberg released the Pentagon Papers, the U.S. government burgled the office of his psychiatrist to look for medical evidence to discredit him. Julian Assange has been obliged to submit himself while in a mentally and physically weakened state and in conditions of the harshest incarceration to examination by psychiatrists appointed by the U.S. government. He has found the experience intrusive and traumatizing. It is a burglary of the mind. And remember, he's kept in Belmarsh. He's kept in like this maximum security prison where they put the worst and the worst of the murderers and everyone else. Whereas all he did was talk to someone in a chat room and upload stuff to a website. There's no reason to have him in these conditions. None. But Murray points out that fortunately, there has been a real change in public understanding and acknowledgement of mental illness. I do not think Julian's periodic and infrequent episodes of very serious depression will be successfully portrayed in a bad light, despite the incredibly crass and insensitive attitude displayed today in court by the U.S. government, who have apparently been bypassed by the change in the attitudes of the last few decades. Yeah, really, the guy ends up sounding more like Nurse Ratched. I have decided to censor much of what was said. I do this on the grounds that, when it comes to his medical history, Julian's right to privacy ought not to be abolished by these proceedings. I have discussed this in some detail with Stella Morris. I have, of course, weighted this against my duty as a journalist to you, the reader, and have decided the right to medical privacy is greater, irrespective of what others are publishing. I have therefore given as full account as I can, while omitting all mention of behaviors or symptoms and of more personal detail. And I could look back at people like Kevin Gosztola, I quoted a bit from him yesterday, and give you more details about this, but you know what? I think I kind of want to protect his privacy too, so I won't go into that, and it's not really relevant anyway. But Murray does say, I will state firmly and resolutely that my account has been truthful. I do not claim it has been impartial. Because in a case of extreme injustice, truth is not impartial. As promised yesterday, this is Professor Michael Kopelman. He visited Assange 19 times in Belmarsh prison, and he concluded, I reiterate again that I am as certain as a psychiatrist ever can be that, in the event of imminent extradition, Mr. Assange would indeed find a way to commit suicide. We talked about this, the possibility that what they really want is for Assange to suicide himself before all of this happens. That way they won't have to go through the embarrassment of a real trial. And a lot of this seems geared towards moving him in that direction. So he said his report was based not just on his many consultations with Assange, but on detailed research of his medical records going back to childhood. Kopelman was firm in stating that he did not find Assange to be delusional. Assange's concerns with being spied upon and plotted against were perfectly rational in the circumstances. And, as we know, well-founded. He said, it is the disorder which brings the suicide risk. Extradition is the trigger. And I hope there are people who are not going to allow that to happen, but, you know. Wait till you hear James Lewis cross-examining Kopelman for 4 hours. And, of course, true to form, what's the first thing he does? He disparages the witness's qualifications, saying that he's not really an expert, and he hasn't worked in prisons. Kopelman pointed out that he had been practicing forensic psychiatry and testifying in numerous courts for over 30 years. When Lewis persisted again and again in querying his credentials, Kopelman had enough and decided to burst out of the bubble of court etiquette. Quote, I have been doing this for over 30 years. And on 5 or 6 occasions, London solicitors have phoned me up and said that James Lewis QC is acting in an extradition case and is extremely keen to get your services for a report. So I think it is a bit rich for you to stand there now questioning my qualifications. This caused really loud laughter in court, which remarkably the judge made no attempt to silence. So again, they had sent the guy 2 huge bundles that morning, and he had never seen because he was testifying at 10 a.m., so he didn't have a chance to. They've been doing that to pretty much every single witness. The first of these was an academic article on malingering, which Kopelman was, in effect, scorned by Lewis for not having read. He said he had read a great many articles on the subject, just not this particular one. And so once again, we have the prosecution seizing upon a single article and giving it the status of Holy Writ, when JSTOR would doubtless bring out hundreds of contending articles. On the basis of this one article, Lewis was continually to assert and or insinuate that it was only the prison medical staff who were in a position to judge Assange's condition. Edward Fitzgerald QC for the defense was later to assert that the article, when it referred to the clinical team, was talking of psychiatric hospitals and not prisons. Kopelman declined to comment on the grounds that he had not read the article. So then Lewis did another one of his Trivial Pursuit questions, trying to make out like Kopelman isn't an expert because he couldn't state, without looking it up, what the 8 possible diagnostic symptoms of a certain WHO classification of severe depression were. Kopelman simply refused to do this. He said he made a clinical diagnosis of the patient's condition, and only then did he calibrate it against the WHO guidelines for court purposes, and pointed out that he was on some of the WHO committees that wrote these definitions. They were, he said, very political, and some of their decisions were strange. And then there's a lot of nitpicking about what he included and what he didn't, which of course, his evidence is only going to be a summary, and it can only be so detailed. But after lunch, Lewis asked Kopelman why his first report had quoted Stella Morris, but not mentioned that she was Julian's partner. Why was he concealing this knowledge from the court? Kopelman replied that Stella and Julian had been very anxious for privacy in the circumstances because of the stress on her and the children. Lewis said that Kopelman's first duty was to the court, and this overrode their right to privacy. Are you freaking kidding me? Medical privacy is sacrosanct. My God, I have stopped short of calling Lewis evil before, but now I will. James Lewis, QC, for the prosecution, for the U.S. government, is an evil person. My God. Kopelman said he had made his decision. His second report mentioned it once it had become public. Lewis asked why he had not explicitly stated they had 2 children. Kopelman said he thought it best to leave the children out of it. Lewis asked whether he was hiding this information because having a partner was a safeguard against suicide. Kopelman said that some studies showed suicide was more common in married people. Besides, what we were considering here was stress of separation from partner and children. So Lewis then referenced Kopelman's report to the work of Professor Niles Meltzer, UN Special Rappoteur on Torture. And those paragraphs address the circumstances of Assange's incarceration in the embassy and of his continual persecution, including the decision of the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention. Lewis even managed to leave the words United Nations out of the name of the working group. As he read each paragraph, Lewis characterized it as nonsense, rubbish, or absurd, and invited Kopelman to comment. Each time Kopelman gave the same reply, that he had only used the work of the psychologist who had accompanied Professor Meltzer and had no comment to make on the political parts which had not appeared in his report. Bereitzer, who is always so keen to rule out defense evidence as irrelevant and to save time, allowed this reading of irrelevant paragraphs to go on and on and on. The only purpose was to enter Professor Meltzer's work into the record with an unchallenged dismissive characterization, and it was simply irrelevant to the witness on the stand. This was Bereitzer's double standard at play yet again. Lewis then put to Professor Kopelman brief extracts of court transcripts showing Julian interacting with the court as evidence that he had no severe cognitive difficulty. Kopelman replied that a few brief exchanges really told nothing of significance, while his calling out from the dock when not allowed might be seen as symptomatic of Asperger's, on which other psychiatrists would testify. Of course, it could also be symptomatic of Judge Dalek telling him that was the only way he could communicate with his defense team, and then shutting him down when he did call out, but anyway. This is another funny part. Lewis again berated Kopelman for not having paid sufficient attention to malingering. Kopelman said 2 normative tests had been applied, one of them the Tom test, T-O-M-M. Lewis suggested that those tests were not for malingering, and only the Minnesota test was the standard. At this point, Kopelman appeared properly annoyed. He said the Minnesota test was very little used outside the USA. The Tom test was indeed for malingering. That's why it was called the test of memory malingering. Again, there was some laughter in court. Then we go back to Kronberg. Lewis said Kopelman was biased because he hadn't taken Kronberg and another U.S. witness into account. Kopelman replied he had not been sent their evidence until substantially after he completed his reports. But he had read it now, and he had seen a great deal of other evidence that contradicted it, both in this case and others. Lewis suggested it was not for him to usurp the judgment of the court on this issue, and he should amend his opinion to reflect the effect of the U.S. prison system on Assange if it were as Kronberg described it. Kopelman declined to do so, saying he doubted Kronberg's expertise and preferred to rely on, among others, the Department of Justice's own report of 2017, the Center for Constitutional Rights report of 2017, and the Marshall report of 2018. Lewis asked if prison conditions and healthcare in the USA were good and the sentences were short, would that cause an alteration to his clinical opinion? Kopelman replied that if those factors were true, then his opinion would change, but he doubted they were true. Suddenly, Bereitzer repeated out loud the part quoted that if prison conditions in the U.S. were good and the sentence were short, then Kopelman's clinical opinion would change, and ostentatiously typed it onto her laptop as though it were very significant indeed. This is very ominous. As she inhabits a peculiar world where it is not proven that anybody was ever tortured in Guantanamo Bay, I understand that in Bereitzer's internal universe, prison conditions in the Colorado ADX are perfectly humane and medical care is jolly good. I could note Bereitzer seeing her way suddenly clear to how to cope with Professor Kopelman in her judgment. I could not help but consider Julian was the last person in this court who needed a psychiatrist. Are you ready for the worst part? I'm serious. Those of you with depression or other such disorders, man, this is going to make you so mad. It made me mad, and I don't have any of those disorders. I just know people who do. But man, oh my God, this is like, this is the Nurse Ratched time. Lewis asked how, if he suffered from severe depression, Julian Assange had been able to lead WikiLeaks, to write books, make speeches, and host a TV program. Seriously? I mean, even just looking at Robin Williams, for example, lifelong sufferer of depression, was able to make, TV shows like Mork and Mindy and all those wonderful movies and accomplish all of the things he did before, sadly, his depression led him to a suicide. Like, if Van Gogh was depressed, how was he able to paint all those beautiful paintings? Because that's not how depression works, you... And even Murray says, I confess that at this stage I became very angry indeed. Lewis's failure to acknowledge the episodic nature of severe depressive illness, even after the professor had explained it numerous times, was intellectually pathetic. It is also crass, insensitive, and an old-fashioned view to suggest that having a severe depressive illness could stop you from writing a book or leading an organization. It was plain stigmatizing of those with mental health conditions. I confess I took this personally. As long-term readers know, I have struggled with depressive illness my entire life, and have never hidden the fact that I have in the past been hospitalized for it and on suicide watch. Yet I topped the civil service exams, became Britain's youngest ambassador, chaired a number of companies, been the rector of a university, have written several books, and give speeches at the drop of a hat. Lewis's characterization of depressives as permanently incapable is not just crassly insensitive, it is a form of hate speech and should not be acceptable in court. Yes. Absolutely, Murray. All my applause. Oh, it's absolutely true. I don't know what YouTube's gonna do this. Maybe they'll demonetize me for hate speech, but the hate speech ain't mine, it's Lewis's. And what on earth is a prosecutor doing saying that in court? And Murray concludes, throughout a full 4 hours, Lewis, on behalf of the government of the USA, not only evinced no understanding whatsoever of mental illness, he never once, not for 1 second, showed one single sign that mental illness is a subject taken seriously for which there is the tiniest element of human sympathy and concern. Not just for Julian, but for any sufferer. Mental illness is malingering, or if real, disqualifies you from any role in society. No other view was expressed. He made plain on behalf of the U.S. government, for example, that Julian's past history of mental illness in Australia will not be taken into account because the medical records have been destroyed. They were destroyed. Oh my God. The only possible conclusion from yesterday's testimony is that the performance of the representative of the United States government was, in and of itself, full and sufficient evidence that there is no possibility that Julian Assange will receive fair consideration and treatment of his mental health issues within the United States system. The U.S. government has just demonstrated that to us in open court to perfection. Geez, how unbelievable is that? So apparently, at least for the foreseeable future, this is going to be the position of the U.S. government. What about when you're railroaded into court for some bogus charge and you have a mental illness and they say, well, then how are you able to hold down a job? Are you serious? Why isn't there outrage? The left, at least, should be taking this 1 day of testimony and displaying outrage about it. Anyone who complains about hate speech, about trigger warnings, about anything like that, and isn't being outraged by what happened on Tuesday is a hypocrite. Nothing more, nothing less. And no sensible person should listen to hypocrites. And here I am, just wondering what the hell they're going to do next. And again, just trying to think what this must be like for Julian. Sitting there in his glass cage, not even being able to say anything to his defense counsel. And having to hear all of this. This is psychotic. This is evil and psychotic. Nothing more. So I hope you'll join me again for day 16 to see what these guys are going to do to him next. Until then, please share this everywhere. Give this copies around. Even if you paid $1 to be on Patreon and Subscribestar and you want to get this early and you want to, just out of respect to me and the other people who paid for it, you're going to hold off on it until it's scheduled and posted. I'm going to say no. Go ahead and post it. Post that MP3 file. See where you can spread it around to. I mean, especially if you can get it to someone who's a journalist or someone who's really influential on social media or anywhere. We have got to get this out there. People have got to know what the U.S. government is doing. Yes, in the land of the free and the home of the brave, this is what the current administration is up to. This is far more important than the Supreme Court nominee. This is far more important than most of the other issues that we're doing, with the possible exception of things like police accountability, because that's an important one. But even if you get accountable police, but they still railroad you in court for bogus charges, if the prosecutor can do crap like this, what hope do we have? What hope do any of us have? This is a threat to each and every one of us. And remember, Assange isn't even American. To my knowledge, he's never even set foot in America. And they're still doing this to him. No one is safe. So please join me again for day 16. And if you really like what I'm doing, please go to donate.bigosity.tv and give whatever you can. Until next time, stay strong and be free.